You're listening to episode 6 of the Emerging Leader podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode, and also thank you so much for your patience over the last 2 weeks as I haven't actually recorded or put out any episodes. There are so many reasons for this, and there's a lot of chaos happening in the Linkwich Gable household at the minute that eventually I'll share about that chaos. And I think today's episode is actually really perfect timing given everything that's happening at the moment, but it definitely just feels like a lot of life changes, a lot of chaos, and a lot of decisions being made. On top of that, it's like sometimes these like really small things happen and you're just like, man, it's just crazy. Like this morning, the delivery driver for our Kohl's order gave us someone else's order. So this person, I don't know, they must have a lot of kids because the amount of milk these people ordered that we now have and need to find a home for is crazy. So we have a ton of milk and a ton of orange juice and a ton of yogurt pouches that we're going to try and find someplace to donate this while Kohl's is replacing our order and hopefully replacing the other person's order as well. So those sorts of things also just add a little sprinkle to the chaos that we're already going through. Today's episode is really about how do we make life-changing decisions. And this is something, like I said, that at the moment, both Joe and I have a ton of life decisions to make. I've made quite a few recently, and I am excited to share those when they actually come to fruition. But at this point, what I will share is the framework that I actually use to make these decisions in my life. And I swear to God, I'm going to struggle to say that word throughout this entire episode. It seems like it's already off to a rough start here, clearly out of practice. But ultimately, making these really hard decisions is just part of life. It's part of personal growth. The bigger the decisions you have to make, the bigger your life is actually going to be ultimately. Like when you're working and living kind of on these fringes of your comfort zone and these sorts of things, you're going to have to make these choices. And the thing is, it's like you'll never actually really know if you're making the right choice. But there's a whole bunch of things that you can do to at least feel more confident that you're making the right choice. And that's what I'm going to go through with you today. So how do I personally do it? What have I read that's really helped me in this space? And some encouragement for you as well as you're going through these really hard decisions and life-changing moments, and a bit of a framework to actually use for that. So with that, thanks for joining me on this long-winded intro, and let's get into the episode. Thank you for being here. The Emerging Leader Podcast. All right, so the fact of the matter is, like I said, decisions are just part of life. They're challenging, often like they're really quite confusing and complicated. It's pretty rare that you're just going to get a super easy, cut and dry decision. Definitely not in the space where you're really trying to grow and really trying to evolve in your life. So they often involve uncertainty. They're often going to involve multiple options where it is really deciding in this gray area. And also sometimes they can have consequences, both obviously positive and negative to these decisions, which I feel like sometimes that makes us really paralyzed and not wanting to actually make the choice or do anything. But actually that's the worst decision you could make, because also inaction is also a decision. So I guess that's kind of the first lesson, and something that I personally tell myself a lot is that not doing something is also a choice, and that is almost always the wrong choice to make. So instead of kind of, I guess, staying where you are, make sure you're pushing forward. So there's a quote, again, Hormozy quote, which you guys might be getting sick of by now on the podcast, but it's really that the person who can make the most decisions and be right most of the time wins. And the key thing there is that you have to be right most of the time. You don't have to be right all the time. We all make the wrong decision. We all have, regrets. But also, and something I'll get into later, is like, how do you actually know that you've made the wrong decision? It's not that cut and dry. So I guess the first thing here is, how do you actually frame these opportunities to decide as an opportunity for growth, to push yourself forward? If you're uncomfortable in a bit of a decision, that's probably a good thing, actually. It means that you're really pushing yourself closer to the fringe of your comfort zone versus remaining in the same space that you've been up to this point. All right, so the first steps in this actual framework is, obviously you're going to have to really clarify the decision. What are you actually deciding on? And this, it sounds so simple, right? Like, oh, like, let's just define it. But really, like, what's the true decision here? Because also sometimes there are these decisions that you're making on the surface that seem like the main decision, but actually there's something underlying. So I'd really ask yourself, like, what are you trying to decide here? And really clarify what that is truly. What's the true decision? It's probably not that surface level thing that you might think it is. It's probably a decision below that. And obviously identifying your options, like what's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? But also appreciating that you likely don't know the best case scenario here, and you probably are overestimating the worst case scenario. Like we've talked about in previous episodes as well, we can kind of go into this fear trap of really blowing the worst case scenario out of proportion, when in reality, it's probably not that bad. And likewise, kind of on the opposite scale, we really tone down what that best case scenario actually can be. So make sure that you're also considering the fact that you probably don't know what that best case can be. And I've seen this so many times personally in my own life, where I just look at this roller coaster that's been the last 7 years in Australia, and I never could have predicted this. In all of my decisions, I never would have thought that it would lead to the point that I'm at today. So in that, like, you just have to trust also that better things will actually come with these decisions, and it puts you in a position to actually make another good decision, which will then line you up. So again, it's not one decision for the rest of your life. It could be multiple decisions, but obviously you have to identify your options with that. So like I said, evaluating your options here is really, really important, because obviously, yes, like you need to know some of the options, and some of them you will just have no idea, but also you need to bet on yourself in this. And this is something I've been saying to my team over the last week, again, as some changes are happening there, and saying always bet on yourself to create either like the best case scenario outcome that you believe you have, or outcomes that you might not have thought of as well. So you have to bet on yourself and bet on the future in order to take this risk. Again, these decisions will very unlikely not come with fear. They will almost always come with fear as well, fear and anxiety. Personally, that's what I'm feeling. I'm physically feeling it in my chest, even talking about this and thinking about some of the things that we're deciding on at the moment. It's very scary, but again, it's all about pushing yourself into that next level. The next thing too is really about how do you actually align with your values in these decisions. I spoke about one of the jobs I had in Australia that I actually resigned from, and that was largely a values-based decision. So which decision lines up most with the values that you have? And we'll do another episode specifically on values and how to determine your highest values. Personally, for me, like adventure and fun and a bit of like chaos is definitely one of my highest values, which also can make it tough for decision making, because adventure sometimes means that I'm not doing a proper risk assessment. So you definitely need to balance those things out as well. So which choice here is going to make you more into that person you want to be? And when we spoke about identity, that was really critical. It's about who is the identity of the person you want to be? And we'll get into more of like the really critical framework I use that I've copied from someone else or taken from someone else, that all of you will know who this person is. But really it's about, what does that future self or that identity that I want to be, what would they decide? How would their values make them choose something here? But also a question I ask in this space is one, of course, like I said, like what would that type of person that I want to be at an identity level? And also for me, it's about which choice will get me closer to being that person that I want to be, like we discussed previously with identity. Now, the next one here, this is strictly for consideration, because people take this way too far, and I'm almost reluctant to talk about it on here, but I actually think it's important because it's definitely something people think about when they're making decisions, myself included, but we cannot get caught up in it, and that is opportunity cost. So every choice means that you're giving up something else. It's very unlikely that you can have all of everything when you're making these decisions. So you have to consider, what are you actually giving up in order to make this decision? Now, that is a double-edged sword, because people often don't want to make a decision because they're caught up in like their opportunity cost, I guess, of other decisions, but also the sunk cost of what they've put in so far. So don't get caught up in this, because again, one, I see this all the time with people who don't want to leave their jobs even though they hate them because, they've like sunk so many years into this company. Or they don't, same with relationships where it's like, we've already been together for 10 years. So it's kind of like, a bit whatever. You cannot get hung up on that, because that's not a great basis for making a decision. If all of your decisions have brought you to this point, if you want something different, you need to make different choices and you need to make different decisions. Also, when it comes to opportunity cost of other opportunities or things that you're deciding between, again, when we talk about evaluating the outcomes, it's likely that we can also have this kind of like grass is greener decision-making framework where we're over-evaluating, or I guess like overstating the benefits or the faults of other options as well. So it's just something to be really cautious of, so that you're not considering opportunity cost into either then driving you into inaction, or making a decision that's actually not truly aligned because it could be a bit safer and you don't want to give things up, when in reality, giving things up is just the nature of decisions. It's unfortunately collateral damage and just essential when you're making decisions. And there will always be collateral damage in making some of these things. And saying collateral damage makes it sound really severe. It doesn't necessarily have to be severe, but there will always be something to give up when making these decisions. And that's honestly, personally, that's probably the hardest part, because you do invest in yourself, you do invest in other people and your experiences and things. And to make a decision and seemingly, because you're not throwing it away, but to seemingly, I guess, move in a different direction and take the risk and bet on yourself is very, very scary. So I can empathize with you in that. So next, it's all about how do you seek counsel in this, but you have to make the decision alone. So everyone and their dog will want to give you advice. I've seen that a lot recently, but you have to really consider, who are you taking advice from? And I love, again, another Alex Hormozi framework where he has, I think it's like 7 levels. I should have looked this up beforehand. 7 levels of people that he takes advice from. At the very bottom is social media comments, like does not take advice from them. And all the way up through the 7 levels, I think at the top is someone who's done what he's wanted to do, plus taught someone like him to do what he wants to do. So it's both like the, I guess, demonstrator and the teacher of someone very similar to him. So you have to kind of use this evaluation framework to decide, who are you going to take advice from? And this has been really, really important for me lately, to really only take advice from people that I personally would want to swap places with, or really, really respect their opinions for different reasons. Because also people will give you advice on your decision through their own belief system. And also, as sad as it is, do not underestimate the old crab in the bucket thing here, where some people will give you advice because they actually don't want to see you succeed, which is really quite sad. And they'll, very much highlight the risks of what you're doing versus the benefits. And so you just, again, have to be really cautious of when this is happening and who do you actually take advice from. So absolutely seek counsel on your decision to make sure that you're trying to identify as many blind spots as you can in making this choice, but absolutely do what's best for you and make the decision alone. And ultimately, you're going to be the one that has ownership over the final decision. You're the one that has to actually make it work. So make the decision too, understanding that you can't really second guess yourself in this. So you have to absolutely get that advice from people if you want to, but then make the decision by yourself. And also, it's really important to get advice from a varied group of people. So people that are in your position and you want to get there, any mentors that you have, obviously partners if they're not actually part of the decision that you're making, I guess, and really taking that advice where it makes sense. So another quote I love is that advice is valuable, but the responsibility for your decisions are actually yours alone. And that's really sums it up. So yes, get advice, but make your own choices. You are your own person. And also, you know yourself best and whether or not you're actually willing to bet on yourself in some of these decisions as well. All right. So naturally, the final step is actually just committing to the decision. So you have to just make the choice. You can't keep second guessing yourself and you can't wonder what if. So like I said, the worst decision to make is the decision not to do anything. And do not kid yourself. That is absolutely a choice in this. And, a lot of people feel stuck in things, but they're also choosing to stay in the position that they are in some situations. And again, I'm not talking about anything very extreme here, but people choose to stay in careers that they're not really happy with or relationships sometimes. Again, we're reasonable. And so not making a choice is absolutely a choice. And it's often the wrong one. So I would definitely avoid that, but make a choice that helps you actually move forward. So that's kind of how I've broken up my framework into, I think there's 6 or 7 steps in that. But the biggest kind of framework overall that I was really, really keen to share with you today is actually from our pal, Jeff Bezos, the Amazon man. And this is something that he actually came up with when he was deciding whether or not he should start Amazon. And the story goes more or less that he went to his boss at the time and said, hey, this internet thing is really popping off. I think I want to start an online bookstore. And his boss said, well, honestly, that sounds like an amazing idea for someone who already doesn't have a great job, but you have a great job. So you should keep doing this great job. And then someone else will do the online bookstore thing. But hey, great idea. And so he came up with this framework that this is absolutely what I use most in my life. And it probably caters to the more adventurous side of my values. And again, I need to balance this with the risk mitigation framework as well. But his framework that he came up with, he's very, interestingly called the regret minimization framework. Very simple. So what he does and what he did when he decided to actually leave his good job, according to his boss, and start the online bookstore that now became Amazon, is that he projects himself to when he's 80 or 85 years old and asks himself, or kind of puts himself in this frame of saying, looking back on his life and wanting to minimize the number of regrets that he has, what would he do? What would he regret the least? And so he knew that when he was 80, he would not regret quitting his comfortable job and trying the Amazon bookstore thing or online bookstore. Even if it went completely belly up, he was not going to regret participating in it or kind of being one of the first people that was exploring the internet in this type of way, and he wouldn't regret if it failed because he had actually tried. He knew the one thing that he would regret is if he did stay in his job and not try it at all. For me, this honestly really hits home. I've made a lot of these decisions in my life where I knew that, I would just regret it if I didn't try. I'd regret it if I stayed in Canada and didn't just go out to Australia, even if it was for 18 months. I knew I would regret it if I didn't quit the job I didn't like and just enjoy the last 3 months that I had in the country before I was supposed to be deported. I knew I'd regret if I stayed in one city versus moving out. All of these different things. And currently, this is exactly the framework I'm using is what will I regret the least? And how do you minimize that regret? So personally, I would project yourself to that 80-year-old self when you're, sitting in your Tommy Bahama chair on the beach in your comfy clothes because you don't actually care what people think, and why not start doing some of that stuff now and asking yourself, what would you regret the least? You're probably not going to regret failing on these things. You're going to regret not trying at all. So you must embrace the fear and the unknown in making these decisions. And actually, I think the fear and the unknown is part of what makes it exciting, because if you knew absolutely that you were going to succeed, then it wouldn't really be a hard decision at all. But also, that's a bit of a question that I ask myself is, if I knew 100% that I would succeed, then what would I do? And it's almost always doing that really scary thing. Like we spoke about in the War of Art, the more scared you are, the more sure that you can be that that's the direction that you actually need to follow. So also, this can often get confused with this whole burn the boats thing. You do not need to burn the boats. You do not need to quit your job, break up with your girlfriend, move out of your house all in 1 week. Absolutely. You do not have to burn the boats. You can test these sorts of decisions. And if there's a way that you can be agile in this, and I guess test smaller versions of these decisions to see how they play out, you absolutely should. And I would definitely advocate for that. So you can absolutely test the waters and also push yourself out of your comfort zone by doing that. So these small steps and small decisions that lead you, again, more to that person and identity that you want to be. Because it's never just going to be one decision. It's going to be many, many decisions that get you to where you are. And honestly, the further on you go, the more decisions you're going to have to make. And I've definitely learned that over the last few years. So what I'd like to leave you on is actually this parable that I heard on a podcast. It's about a Chinese farmer. There are different versions of it, but one of the versions is this. So it's about this farmer, and he gets his son a horse. And everyone's like, oh my God, that's so amazing. How great that you got the son a horse. And he says, maybe, we'll see. And then the son is riding the horse, and the son falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And everyone's like, oh my God, that's so awful that he would break his leg. That's terrible. And the farmer just says, maybe, we'll see. And then because of the son breaking his leg, when the war actually started, the son wasn't able to get drafted to the war because his leg was broken. And everyone again was like, oh my God, that's so amazing. How lucky for your son. And the farmer just said, maybe, we'll see. And the point of this is that you never really know whether a decision is actually going to be really positive or really negative. You never truly know in that moment. It's just, life is just a series of these decisions where things are positive or maybe they're negative in the moment. But if you extrapolate that out far enough, and this is a bit, not morbid, but I don't know the word for it specifically. It's a bit morbid, I guess. But if you extrapolate that out far enough, then you're dead and it doesn't matter anyways. So life is just a series of these decisions, and things that seem awful at the time could absolutely be the best thing for you in the long run. Like for me, getting rejected from Southeast Water, which was my only prospect at the time, my first job in Australia, that felt in the moment like, oh my God, there's absolutely no way that this is going to be positive. This is the end. It felt like the end. And now looking back, it's like, oh my God, that was the best thing that could have happened because of all of these other opportunities that it opened up. And I can't say for sure that one, I'd still be in Australia, and two, that I'd be doing this podcast or I'd be making the decisions that we are today if it wasn't for that rejection. So really, you don't know if a decision is going to be the best or the worst or somewhere in between. It's very likely to end up somewhere in between, but you also know that nothing will change if you don't make a decision. So I would just really encourage you to continue making these choices and to go through these frameworks, but most importantly, to project yourself out to that 80-year-old self, that 85-year-old self, and ask yourself, what would you regret the least? Use that Jeff Bezos framework of regret minimization. What would you regret the least? What would you be most proud of yourself for actually taking the plunge on and betting on yourself for, even if it did fall apart? And that's absolutely what we're doing at the moment. So I think it's incredibly timely with everything going on. And ironically, I had planned this episode for quite a long time. But yeah, I really hope that you see yourself in a bit of this and can reflect on some of the decisions that you're trying to make in your life as well, and make sure that you're using a bit of this framework and also not overthinking it. Do the risk assessment, do your due diligence on the choices that you're trying to make, definitely, but also understand that it's inevitable that you're going to have blind spots in the choices that you're making and the unknowns, like the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns as well. And that's just part of life. So we can never truly tell. But regardless, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. It's great to be back in the HQ, which is our home office here, recording some episodes. And also, we have so many incredible guests coming up. So it's not just going to be me on the podcast, which is also part of why I've been off for the last 2 weeks, because I've been dealing with guest management, which I feel like in the future I'm going to need help with because I'm not a great person at responding to emails. Part of my identity, not a great emailer. Anyways, so we have some great guests coming up. So we have a personal brand specialist coming up in the next 2 weeks. We have someone who is a financial advisor specifically for young professionals and millennials. So that's going to be really, really cool. I'm super stoked for that. We also have a naturopath coming on that specifically works with busy people and young professionals like engineers, lawyers, CEOs, executives. And we're going to debunk a lot of the stuff that you're getting marketed on Instagram. And when I say you, I mean me as well. And most of it I've bought. So we are going to debunk a lot of that and talk about how you can actually become healthier as a busy person. So I'm really, really looking forward to all of the guests that we have coming up. Those are just a few of the ones that we have scheduled in the next few weeks. So again, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. Really, really stoked to have you here. Thank you so much for the love on Spotify and on YouTube. If you haven't subscribed on either of those platforms, I would really, really appreciate it if you do. It just helps the podcast reach more people. And yeah, I'm super excited about it. So thanks again. And I hope that wherever you are, you're enjoying your weekend, you're enjoying your day, and that you embrace some hard decisions upcoming. And I would love to hear about those too. If you're making some hard choices, definitely reach out and I would love to chat more about them. Anyways, thanks again and stay tuned for the next episode. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that are listening to the podcast.